thanks everybody for joining the show today. We're Rooted Leadership Podcast. I don't know what episode we're on. We're in the 70s, it feels like now. Started right in the middle of the pandemic, just trying to learn as much as we can and house some information and knowledge so that we can keep sharing it. And it's just spread organically. We have zero marketing efforts for the podcast, and a lot of people all over listen to it, which is kind of fun. And at first we were doing a lot of one-on-one interviews. Chad's been on the show a couple of times, and that's always fun, and we've gotten pretty deep in those. But the last few, we've been trying to do some more kind of group roundtable discussions. And Chad has been kind of a iconic speaker the last 5 years. He's come back every year. His content around dangerous love is so applicable to the things that we're doing that anytime he's in town, I want to get him on the show, want to keep having conversation. Jessica, you participated last year, so you know some of Chad's stuff. Hassan, have you read some of his books?
Yes.
So we got people in the room that know your content and have some questions for you. So I thought that it would be fun to do that. But before, let's some brief intros. Chad, obviously you've been on the show several times. I've known you for many years. You've been a great mentor to me, professor, friend, boss. And now I get to work with your son. Would never thought that would have happened, 10, 12 years ago when we first started working together, that I'd get to be working so close with your son. He's amazing. Chad works all over the world. Author of Dangerous Love. You're writing another book right now. I know, and probably several more that would be down the pipe. I don't know. But great thought leader, professor, background, worked with ESPN, was a writer. You feel like you've done it all, and lots of mediation and negotiation all over different pockets of the globe. And of course, I know most important to you, you're your father and husband. So that's Chad. H. And I don't mean to introduce y'all all in front of to everybody, but H is a participant in Groundwork this year, which is kind of fun. H, why don't you tell us about yourself real quick?
So I am currently behavioral health coordinator with the Department of Public Safety Standards and Training in Oregon, which is the public safety training academy that represents the entire state. Previous to that, I was the training division director for a couple of years, and now I'm doing something that I enjoy much, much more. The aspects of behavioral health in terms of how it impacts our communities from the lens of our law enforcement officers, but also the law enforcement officers who are engaging with those communities, has been something that's been important to me for a long, long time. Prior to coming to Oregon 5 years ago, I did 13 years in law enforcement in Western Colorado, held various different roles there. And I really think my interest in the behavioral health side came from a couple of tragedies that I was involved with, unfortunately, that really drove me to get very heavily involved in those aspects so I could help kind of shift the mindsets of our law enforcement officers, both in terms of how they view themselves, but also how they view the communities that they serve.
And H surprised me this year when we started. We start out at the coast and we meet everybody kind of as strangers. And, you can come off looking pretty tough and intimidating, but I was so surprised by how quickly you dove into everything that we were doing. And you surprised me, kind of paradigm shift for me. So, and Chad, I don't want to skip over you introducing. I have some questions for you, though, to help prompt your intro. But before that, can we get to Jessica, or do you have something
I just want our viewers that are watching to be able to distinguish that to my left is H and to my right is Chris, because they got a similar vibe going on here.
The rugged look.
My beard is far more gray. That'll be the indicator.
I'm not very rugged, but I'll take it. Jessica, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Jessica Otjen. I am currently the Resource Development Director for the YMCA of Marion and Polk counties. And I've been at that organization for about 2.5 years. This is my first role doing resource development, fundraising, donor relations, and I am really enjoying it. I feel like I got to come into this organization at a really special time in the organization because we just finished a massive capital campaign to rebuild the Salem Family YMCA. So that building and our association has been around for 131 years here in our community. So what we have seen and what I have seen in my work is generations of families that have come through this organization that have been impacted by the mission, that are very caring about our community and the people that live here. And so it's great to work in a community like that and at an organization like that that cares so much. So I'm learning a ton in my role. I've spent a majority of my career working in nonprofit. Started off with the Boys and Girls Club, working with teenagers and at-risk youth, helping them build important life skills, college, career readiness, and really just helping kids feel loved and appreciated and like they are important in our community. So yeah, teenagers always have a soft place in my heart. So yeah.
And Jessica, and if you're comfortable sharing, I love, we've talked about it many times, but when you started Groundwork last year, you kind of had an interesting sort of paradigm shift to your own and a change of heart and mind over the first couple of months. Do you mind sharing a high level of that? Because I think it's a fun story.
Yeah, sure. So I tend to be a little more skeptical. I found the older that I get, the more skeptical I am about things. And so I kind of went into Groundwork knowing that it is backed, or knowing that Groundwork is I guess provided.
Funded. Yeah. Our
Funded.
donor is a prominent philanthropist in our community. Yeah.
Yeah. So I went in knowing that, one of our community's largest philanthropists is, backing this program, helping fund this program. And so it almost felt like I couldn't really say no. And I was looking at it from that lens instead of the lens of how can I use this information to help me grow. And it was, I think it was right about the time that you came in, Chad, maybe a little bit before, that I started to realize that this is on me. And I had this shift of, it doesn't matter who is backing this. It doesn't matter who is behind it. This is an opportunity to come in and learn and grow and do better things for our community and be a better team player at my organization and be, a better wife, mom, all the things that happen in everyday life. And so it was about a little more than the midway point, before the midway point, that I started to realize that this stuff is legit. So, yeah.
Awesome. So if it was right around Chad's time, thanks, man. You must have saved it.
It was the basketball, or was that the Aikido?
It was when you pushed over Jacob.
To push Jacob down?
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've been bracing ourselves who's going to get pushed over this year. No,
be ready, H.
Yeah, probably H.
It will probably be you, H, now that I know you.
So, again, Chad, you flew into town to join us, and anybody that wants to get to know you better, we obviously have other episodes they can listen to, and your book, and there's lots of information. But today we wanted to dive in, just asking questions. I asked both H and Jessica to come prepared with questions that they wanted to ask you. I know you've looked at some of those, but this first one will actually, for any new listeners, viewers, whomever that don't know who you are, this one might give a good snapshot of a little bit about you. So that's why I held off you introducing yourself. But it's this first question, and it's, when did you know that you were going to be effective, or that maybe helping people through conflict was a kind of a life journey that you wanted to take?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My mom would say kind of was born into that. Like at a young age, she told me that I was the middle child, but I also just was a strange child in a fairly kind of country conservative family growing up in the Midwest. But I was so concerned at a young age about social issues, about discrimination, about mistreatment of anybody. all of the time, that it was actually really an odd experience, I think, for my family about it. So by the time I was in high school, I was organizing protests and getting in trouble at school. My mom worked for the school system at the time and would be embarrassed to have to come pick me up because I was a troublemaker. And I think that actually, really early on, Chris, like even when I started college, peacemaking and conflict resolution was a little bit more on like activism, protest, side of things. John Lewis calls it good trouble, which is, maybe, I don't know that I was always in good trouble. Sometimes I was just in trouble, but I actually think it was towards the end of my undergraduate college career that I started to actually notice some patterns, that I really cared a lot about change. But a lot of the stuff that I was doing made a big splash, but then it just fizzled out really, really quickly. And as far as like sustainable change goes, I wasn't actually very, very effective in all that. I felt good to like be, stick it to the man, like be part of the, part of the, the movement, if you will. But when it came to actually like real change, it just wasn't happening. So it was really my senior year. I was there wasn't peace building or conflict resolution at the university. So I was doing a major in history with a minor in political science and sociology, that I just dove into my senior year. I had to write a senior, like kind of history capstone, sort of thinking about nonviolence, thinking about, these movements, thinking about peacemaking, and just reading a lot and studying a lot about great people who did it, and realizing that, one, I was not nearly as effective as I could be, because I actually was making a major mistake in peace building, which is that I saw whoever I was opposed to kind of as the enemy that needed to be defeated, right? Like whoever was doing the repression or doing the wrong thing, those were people that I was out to kind of humiliate and sort of publicly shame. That was sort of my style, right? And then hopefully they would back down, and then you'd get this huge victory lap, right, around it. That wasn't actually very effective. And that actually learning how to see my enemy as a person, understanding what their needs and reasons for doing the things that they were doing with, and actually trying to come up with collaborative solutions together, wasn't as sexy as the other thing was, like didn't give you the same thrill rush, but was actually a lot more effective in doing this. And so at the time, one of my mentors was a professor who was doing the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, who was deeply involved in that. Another one of my mentors was a lawyer who was working on child custody and marital custody cases. And they pointed me in the direction of law school, because I knew I wanted to do something around this, but I didn't actually know what to do with it. And it wasn't until I got in law school that I had a really life-changing moment. I'm in law school. I'm at Georgetown. I have these amazing professors that are doing this crazy stuff, and they're making the same critique about the law that I was starting to see myself, that the law can kind of force change, but it can't change people's hearts. That was my big takeaway from my first year at law school, just because of the particular amazing professors that I had that were working in areas of human rights and civil rights law and alternative dispute resolution. I just got really lucky. You could get assigned to like one of a number of sections, and I just got assigned to like this group of individuals that were all sort of thinking along those lines. And then one day, Dennis Ross, who was the chief U.S. negotiator for Middle East peace, came onto our campus just as a speaker. And I was interested in what was going on in the Middle East, so I just showed up as a student in the audience, and I watched him. And he was really depressed because if anybody follows politics and knows the Middle East peace process, there was always these glimmers of hope before the bottom drops out and it just goes to disaster. This was like a cycle, like you'd get close and then something really bad would happen and it would all just crumble apart. And Dennis had been a part of this for like a decade, and he was just coming back after it all fallen apart again. So there's this like guy who spent 10 years of his life, 15 years of his life doing this one thing, and it's falling apart again. And he was really reflective. He was thinking about what was going on. And he said this line to me that, like, it really did change my life. He said that, we're trained as diplomats to bring these leaders into the room and get them to like work together and problem solve together. But then when they go back to their people, sometimes the same people that they riled up as part of the political process of hating the other side or what have you, they're actually branded as traitors when they come back because why did you make peace with this person? Like, this is the enemy. And, I had some thinking like this, like myself kind of growing up, and that in the State Department, they really had no mechanism to go on the ground and work with people to prepare them for peace. So when their leaders made an agreement, they were ready or willing or open to actually being able to accept that. And he just looked out in the audience and said, like, that's going to be on your generation to figure out how to do that. And like a little fire just went inside of me. And I said, like, that's what I want to learn how to do. I want to work on the ground. I want to work with people, and I want to help them be able to put together movements that prepare people for peace. And so I waited in line afterwards. I went up and talked with him. I said, you lit a fire, just go tell me where to go do that, or I can learn how to do that because that's what I want to do. And he said, well, if I knew, I would have told you guys. Like, I don't actually know. And so he ended up pointing me to one of my mentors, Wallace Warfield at George Mason, who had worked with Dr. Martin Luther King during the Civil Rights Movement and worked as a federal mediator. And I skipped school, went out, met him the next day. After a long conversation with him, like, I knew like what he did was what I wanted to do, and I've been doing it ever since.
Love that. These two know based on the stories I've shared, but you're the person that lit that fire in me, and I've been fortunate enough to remain close to you since then. But with H and Jessica, reading the book or hearing Chad last time and being involved in all of this, what has impressed upon you from any of the Dangerous Love content, anything that Chad might have said last year that has brought questions about that you want to ask him?
Lots of questions. I do want to go back to your...
Is it what's wrong with me?
No, not at all.
Because that would definitely be a real question reading some of the stories in Dangerous Love.
Well, one of the things I do want to ask you, though, pretty specifically is how do you stay positive, right? Dealing with what you deal with as frequently as you do around the world, how do you maintain an air of positivity that allows you to go forward?
That's a great question, because I really... in my job, I do see the worst of people most of the time, right? Like most of the conflict encounters, and especially because I tend to work on more extreme types of conflicts than some people do, I do get to see a lot of the worst of humanity, and it's terrifying at times. It's very disheartening. We were watching a television show the other day with my wife, and she's just like, I just can't believe that person could do it. And I sat there and I'm like, oh, I believe people are capable of anything. Like, that came out of my mouth. And she was like,
it's true though. Well, we see it.
Like everyday people, they're capable of anything, right? I've just seen it all. And so I'm not surprised in the same way. And I'm going to be honest with you, like, I'm at a point, like in our own country here in the United States, that I'm really concerned. I'm really concerned. I've worked in Northern Ireland. I've worked in the Middle East. I've seen what happens to polarized countries when it gets to a breaking point, and then the sort of devastation that comes because of that, the rise in the level of violence and hatred towards each other. I've been working in societies that have been trying to, Northern Ireland kind of they've had some success in pulling themselves out of that. In the Middle East, they're in the middle of it, and they've been in it for a long time. And, I come back to my own country, and I've seen, just since I've been studying this and working on this, the United States being in many ways a positive example of being able to how to learn how to deal with a lot of our crap. We have a lot of crap and a lot of historical crap in the United States too, but I always saw it as some progress, right, that we've been sort of making, and like that, watching that timeline go. And it seems like we're regressing in some really scary and terrible ways. And so in some ways, the blessing, the curse of doing conflict resolution is I see the patterns. I've studied them historically. I've worked with them, and I see all of those same things happening like on my front lawn now, right? And it's like I want to scream to people, like, you have no idea what you're getting into. You have no idea where this leads. and none of it is good, and none of what we're arguing about is worth it. It's just not worth what is coming if we don't learn how to collaborate and solve problems together despite our differences. Because that's okay. We're always going to have differences, but despite that, the thing that gives me hope is that I've worked with so many people that you would never think in a million years could change that. That because of their actions, their behaviors, the things that they've done, the things that they've written, the things that they've said, these are the most extreme people. They're never going to move. And I've been told that many times going in, well, we're going to deal with this person. Like, trust me, we've tried to deal with them for years. This person, there's no way they're going to move. And then they turn. Not always right away, almost never right away. But over time they turn. And, I look at my own life, and if you read Dangerous Love, a lot of the bad stories are actually about me. And one of the things that I can say is I've learned how to change. And so I think the thing that gives me hope in all that is that I do actually believe that people can change. No matter what you've done in the past, no matter what you've said in the past, you can change. It's hard. It's not easy. It takes a lot of support and a lot of help, but it's possible. And I believe that here in the United States, it's not too late. We can change, but people have to want to change. And unfortunately, a lot of times, at least in the work that I do, it isn't until they hit that rock bottom, it isn't until they do everything wrong that they're willing or open to change. And, I think my dream right now in writing this book, and I'm working on another one right now, and doing podcasts like this, is to try to get in people's ears. It's so much easier to fix this now than it's going to be able to fix in 5 years or 10 years if we keep on the pattern like this. And so we really, really, really have to feel like this is something urgent that we need to do now.
Thanks, Chad. It's both hopeful and a bit devastating to see the reality of that. And we talk a lot about in Groundwork of facing kind of the reality and the gap that might exist towards potential. But what else comes to mind as he shares that, either of you, H or Jessica, and things that we talk about in Groundwork, or other things that have been on your mind?
Yeah, I actually had a question for you, and you kind of spoke to it a little bit when you talked about, like, here in America, what you're seeing. And you've traveled all over the world doing conflict resolution, peacekeeping. And I was curious I was kind of surprised to hear that you thought, like, America is kind of good at this, like, we're okay at it. But you have some concerns lately. I'm wondering, like, based off of different cultures that you visited, is there anybody that's just really good at this?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And I want to put a caveat. I think America is not doing a good job right now. And I think historically we've done a terrible job. I just think that there was a moment, maybe, starting in the 1950s or 1960s, where we started to reckon with some of that. And I look at the civil rights movement in the United States, for example, and see that as a very positive development that did change some hearts and some minds and some lives, for example. And, the thought that we could have a Black president and Barack Obama, what was that, 40 or 40 years, 50 years after that. I mean, that's progress at a certain way. But then lately, I feel like it's not, that progress has been erased. But yeah, let me tell you about, so I live in Hawaii. And we have a very international student body here, and I get to work with a lot of Pacific Islanders, and I feel like a lot of people don't get to know Pacific Islanders. There's not a lot of them, and I think people think because they live in such small countries, kind of in the middle of nowhere, like, what do they sort of have to offer to the world? But then if you think about it a different way, you live in an island. Right? You have this culture that lives in an island. You have very limited resources on an island, right? What's the most important resource that you have on an island? Fresh water. In fact, the word Hawaii, the vai is water. That's the name of the island is water. Why was it such an attractive place for people? Because it had an abundance of fresh water, right? Like that. And, human beings can go, 3 days like without fresh water. You're surrounded by a lot of water, but it's not drinkable, right? So like the fresh water is the thing. And they're really separated from each other by long distances. It's not like the United States where, if you didn't like where you're living, like you just packed up in your wagon or got on your horse or even walked a lot of times, right? Just, 100 miles or 200 miles away. It's just not possible. And so they developed really sophisticated conflict resolution mechanisms within these cultures because it was do that or die. I mean, essentially, that was the only thing. If those communities were going to flourish, they had to have them. And so when I started to get to know my students from Samoa, from Fiji, from Tonga, from Maoris, from New Zealand, and they would sit in my classes and kind of be like, right? Like, it's good, but I kind of learned later because I started to do work with them and started to, travel to some of those countries. Like I was standing up and like talking about how amazing McDonald's hamburgers were when they were eating at Five Guys, right? Like they were just like, yeah. And there wasn't a lot written about this. There wasn't, in the academic space, it's not like this has really been worked out. But this was just stuff that they were doing in their own homes, right? Or in their own communities. And since then, we've had graduates that have gone back, that have started to do their master's and PhD. They're actually starting to work on this now. One of my colleagues, one of my former students, Michael Lingalinga, has a whole new thing out, a new conflict resolution thing called HIVA. And one of the reasons that I think, and I'll just tell you why I think that was sort of the historical context, but the other thing that I think they're so great at is two things. One which will blow your mind for Americans, and we just can't wrap our heads around it. In Samoan, there's no word for me or I. It doesn't exist. There's a word for us, but there's no word for me or I. And so everything we talk about in Dangerous Love, the move from like self-preservation to us preservation, right? And for most Pacific Islanders, everything is about us preservation. There's no move from self to us because everything is us. They're already there. They live in that world. There's a deep value that goes there that they believe in. Really, really, it's really important. And so when you're working with them, you don't have to make that shift that you have to do in so many more individualistic cultures, and where that is one of the big shifts. Always, whenever I'm working with people in those sorts of cultures, is that move from self-preservation to us preservation. And the other thing that they have this concept, they actually literally, the word is the same in several cultures. It's called va or space. And the whole thing is that every human being has a space between them. And our job in life is to tend to that space between us. And you can have good va or bad va, but the goal in the community is to have good va. And I'm constantly thinking about, how is our va right now? How is our relationship? And when you talk to most Americans and ask them, like, how is your relationship with your wife? They'll say good or bad, but the key is like, well, why? Like, why is it good? And it's almost always selfish. Like, if it's good, well, my wife's amazing. She makes me this, or she does this for me, or she helps me this way, or she's really beautiful, or like whatever. But it's all about like what they're giving me. Or why is it bad? Well, they're not doing this for me, or they don't look this way, or they don't take care of themselves the way they used to anymore. Or whatever. It's still like, it's all the entire thinking is really around the relationship is how it impacts me. Right? But in va, I'm always thinking the opposite. How am I impacting the relationship right now? What am I doing to impact this for good or for bad? And so, because that also sits right literally at the heart of the culture, this is a really common way for them to think about conflict in relationships is, what am I doing to affect the va? Which I feel like in the culture I grew up with, in Western culture, it's what is everybody else doing to affect the va, right? Like that's typically the way to go about it. I'm not saying Pacific Islanders don't have conflict, or that sometimes it turns destructive, or that they haven't had times of violence or war in the past. I'm not saying that, but in general, I just find them to be in a completely different space. Dangerous Love to them just is like common sense. Like they'll say that all the time. Like, you just wrote a book about common sense. All right. And I'm like, it wasn't so common sense to me, right, when I wrote it, but that's how they see it. And so it's definitely a place that I think more people in the world should look at. And even I'll just end with this last thing, even aloha, right? You hear this word aloha and it means greeting or whatever, but in Hawaiian, the word translates into the sharing of the ha, and the ha is the breath of life. And indigenous Hawaiians and Maoris and Samoans, when they greet each other, they touch their foreheads and they breathe in the ha, right? And when I say aloha, I'm recognizing I'm taking your spirit in, right? It is a beautiful way of saying, I see you as a person. I see your humanity. And as I receive your humanity, it's like a covenant. It's like a promise. Like when I say aloha, I promise to like care for it. I promise to treat it as sacred like it is. And that I'm going to help you along your life journey. And, and how do we greet? Like stick my hand out, like nice to meet you, right? Like there's something that's actually very formal and stiff about it a lot of times, where I think in this culture, it is this recognition of the value and worth of like every living thing and the spirit behind it. And for most Pacific Islanders, it literally means every living thing. That includes animals and the ocean and the earth and everything else.
Yeah, and these two might, hopefully are familiar when we talk a lot about the space between in our curriculum, and one of the influences in the development of that was Va, right? And we talk about daring to explore it, venturing out into the space between, obviously metaphorical, sometimes literal, but the space between us and others. And, Chad, I like that you talk about aloha because you can correct me if I'm wrong, but, in Hawaii, if you're a foreigner, they call you haole, right? And a lot of people think that means white man, like haole's white man. But actually, and again, Chad, feel free to correct me. If I remember correctly, haole just means they don't share the same breath. Like they won't share it. Like, because when white man first came, they didn't share the same breath. They did some other form of a greeting. Perhaps it was this, right? And so
it's really devastating, right? Ole means without, and ha is the breath of life. So it's like you're a zombie, or like you're not. You don't have the breath of life, right? Which is not great. Not in that culture. That's not great.
So, Chad, you said those Pacific Island cultures. As you've spoken with them, they said you wrote a book about common sense. As I read it, I was thinking, man, this makes a lot of sense, right? Because individually, all the concepts, they're simple individually, but then when you take them in total, it's when it becomes more difficult. And I did a lot of self-reflection as I read your book. I'm a little bit angry at you for it, but I won't take it out on you. But
that's my favorite response, actually. I ripped up your book and threw it away, but then I taped it back. I literally have a picture of someone who would tape their book back together.
But it was so profound to me that everything I was reading in that book made a tremendous amount of sense. And as I reflected on my own personal history, it's also incredibly difficult to take those things on, right? Because without going into too much depth or detail, there's a lot of things within that book that I'm thinking to myself, okay, you can do this, you can do this, you could do this different, you could do that better. How is what you are or are not doing impacting these other people? And then as I think deeper, I'm that person that's not quite there yet, right? So that's when I think it becomes difficult to see the other side of that coin. And the reason I say that is, so you talk about the Pacific Island cultures. Do you see other common threads around cultures around the world that you've dealt with that have made it either easier or more difficult for them to turn first and start to make the shift where they see people as people?
Well, first of all, thanks for that. And I'm glad you're reading the book, and I'm glad it's impactful, but also thanks for talking about, to me, it's a win when someone's wrestling with it. Because I think the wrestle comes before the change, right? And we just saw this. I was with Kasha, who worked for Groundwork for years, and she was in a class with middle schoolers today. And I was sitting in the back, and she was using this concept, the most dangerous move of turn first. But she's with 8th graders, right? And there was this young man, he was sitting in the back, and she asked the entire class, I want you to think about this person that you're in conflict with and what are like their needs and their challenges or whatever. And this young man nods his head and says, I'm not doing that. And then he put his head down. And, I just watched him for the rest of the thing. And, you could read that one way of, oh, he's not participating or whatever. That's not how I read it at all. I've been in enough of these settings and mediations. That question hit him hard, right? I don't know what was going on in that young man's life, but something serious was going on in his life. There was somebody he was really struggling with right now. And the thought that I needed to see their needs, their challenges or whatever, it overwhelmed him. And he put his head down, on the desk. And afterwards, I went up and was talking to Kasha and then the teacher that was there, that's the teacher of the classroom. And they were like, oh, it looks like he's just not ready to engage it. I'm like, no, he's engaging it. I'm like, it's not that he's not ready. He's engaging it. Frankly, that should be our reaction most of the time, right? If it's too easy, I'm actually more skeptical about it. Either that's not a deep conflict in your life or you're not actually taking this that seriously. But that 8th grade grader, unfiltered reaction of I'm not doing that and putting my head down is like, okay, that was a direct hit, right? It was a direct hit to the heart. And I've built up this wall over time to protect me from thinking about that sort of stuff when I'm in conflict. And this part I think is actually really universal, but it's hard for everybody, right? Is that when I get in conflict, I have to justify those negative feelings that I have towards the other person, right? That I'm in conflict with. And I build up those justification and those stories over sometimes long periods of time. And to question those stories about them is to question something deeply fundamental about myself, right? What if I'm not telling the whole story? What if part of that story isn't actually everything that's going on with that person? And I think the general human reaction to that is say, I'm not going there. I'm not thinking that. And I have the stories. I've got the receipts. I've got the documentation here. And all of this makes me feel better about myself and worse about them. And that is actually, we get in a comfort level with conflict around that. While we say we want the conflict to change and why we hate the conflict, we're actually in this weird comfort level with it because at least I know that I'm right and they're wrong, right? And that to me, I've seen universal across religions, across genders, across cultures, ages, that human beings do that. And undoing that work requires us to say something about ourselves that's really, really hard to say, which is that perhaps I haven't told the whole story about them or me. Perhaps some of the stuff that I've done has been exaggerated or exploded. Perhaps some of this has been self-serving to me so that I can sleep at night and feel better. And that's all part of a cognitive process that our brains go through. And so your reaction of like, great, common sense, it's good, but not right now, or a little bit too much, or I'm angry with you, because anger to me implies that there was something comfortable that you were in before, and now it's making that unsteady. And this took me a really long time. I was working in Northern Ireland, one of my first jobs in grad school, and I naively believed like everybody wants peace, everybody wants conflict, but we were in this conference, and someone from South Africa came who'd done the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and he was talking. And as he was talking, he was talking about this beautiful experience. And maybe this is another group that I would point to that did a really powerful thing, and that was the people of South Africa, and how they dealt post-apartheid with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. To me, is a really inspiring story of telling hard truths, but also offering forgiveness and also offering a way forward for everybody to live together differently than they had before. And as he was telling the stories and the healing that came from that, and why holding on to grudges and not forgiving, and but also not hiding the truth or glossing over the truth, like all those things were going to help Northern Ireland, because this was right during the peace accords in Northern Ireland. It gets to Q&A, and this man in the audience stands up and he raises his hand and he says, "That was a beautiful speech. I appreciate it. It touched me so much. But I just have one question for you. In Northern Ireland, who are the blacks and who are the whites?" And And the problem with that is it's about a 50-50. It was about 50-50 Catholic Protestant. Both sides had stories about how they were victimized in the conflict and the other side was the oppressor. It was clear, at least to the outside world, what was going on in South Africa with apartheid, but much different when you get to Northern Ireland. And the speaker stumbled to answer that question. It was a difficult question to answer. And you could tell no matter what he said, it was going to rile up one side of the audience or the other, which I think was the exact intent of the questioner, by the way. I think he did it deliberately. And as he stumbled over himself and couldn't answer it, I saw the man's face and there was this look of the smile that got on his face of like, oh man, he was saying hard things. He was hitting me right in that heart space. I was saying, nope, nope, nope. And I was trying to find a way out of it and I found my way out, right? So I can get back to the comfort level of hating this other side. And it just hit me. Wait, maybe sometimes we say we want peace. And I bet if I asked that gentleman, do you want peace? He would say absolutely. But a lot of times I think what we want more is justification. Like we want to believe that we're right. And given that stuff up is the real work of Dangerous Love, real work of the Arbinger Institute. And, to me, like, I don't think I understood Dangerous Love until I wrote it 10 times and then reread it 15 times. And I really think for a lot of people, it's on the second or third or fourth go for that we get all the way down to really letting that stuff go and opening myself up that perhaps I've been wrong. And I can own that wrong and really desire, because that's the part about love. And my publisher and I fought a lot about the title, like Dangerous Love, and should we use the word love? And love seems soft. And there's going to be like, you work with police, like the police really going to read a book called Dangerous Love? Like the dangerous part they may like, but the love part, not so much, right? But, I'm not saying love in like a romantic way or even love in a like way, like we love pizza or like we love our friends. I'm saying a love that says like, I care so deeply about you that I am willing to work with you to find a way forward that works like for both of us. But it takes that level of like care and concern to get there. And I think for Dangerous Love to work in the deepest conflicts, like it takes us getting down to that level and not just some sort of superficial or utilitarian, this would be helpful to me. I can intellectually, so I can do that. Like that's not what it's going to take. And so those big changes that I've talked about is when that hatred, that self-deception, all that stuff gets filled with love. And when there's love, it compels. It's powerful for people. And they can do really, really hard things and even say hard things and admit hard things because that love is now driving the bus.
We're running short on time, and I have another question I actually want to flip and turn on H and Jessica, and then maybe have enough time to hear some of your thoughts on how they answer. But to flip it, kind of your question that you initially asked Chad is, what was that change that you experienced? You're talking a little bit about that change while reading Dangerous Love, but I remember beginning of the year at the retreat, I don't know, I think it was day 2. Day 1's really heavy, long. I think day 2 you came up and you were talking to me offline, while we were on a break, and you told me about how you made a phone call to somebody, and that night, I don't remember, Florida or something, I can't remember, and you made a change, right? And so what caused that change? And the same question for you to be thinking about, Jessica, as well. You told a little bit about it, and it could be related to maybe your paradigm shift of the programming, but you probably have lots of moments in life that you've made this sort of a shift or change. But the ones that I'm aware of, what was it that caused it? What was the moment? What was poking and pricking at you that was hard but also welcoming that made you want to make that change, make that shift?
It was the entire first day, quite honestly. But most profoundly, it was the conversations around forgiveness. And for me, there's a long personal history, again, that I won't go into depth about, but that day was a struggle for me on many levels. And reading Dangerous Love brought a lot of that back up as I continued to read through it and understand and kind of be very self-reflective. The phone call was, it was to my aunt in Florida. And I thought I did the right thing that night, right? Because I needed to get things off my chest. I felt horrible at the end of day one. I needed to get things off my chest. But as I stayed in that weekend session, and as I read the book, and as I've grasped and understood more about what all of these things mean, it was actually just doing more of what I had been doing for years. I was doing more colluding. I was doing more self-deception. I was doing more of the things that have continued to hold me back from actually moving forward, right? So although it felt good that night to get those things out there and get it off my chest and talk to somebody who had common ground within the same kind of relational boundary, the more I read, the more I understood, the more I took in, the more I recognized the fact that I was just digging myself deeper than I actually was before. So it was interesting that you asked me that question today, because that's one of the things that I was reflecting on as I read through the book, was that first day and that phone call, and the fact that, again, I didn't do myself any favors. It felt good that day, it felt good that night, but in terms of the overall, that was a stark realization when I finally recognized that I've just been continuing in that same pattern, that same path.
Yeah. Thanks, H.
For me, I think about what you were saying, Chad, with the I, me, myself. And I think that that is something that is really rampant in our culture. And I we see it everywhere, right? And I think that I am guilty of that. And so initially, if we use the example of how I felt coming into Groundwork, it was, oh, this is my time. This is, how is this going to help me versus how can I use this to help us? How can this be about us? And I think that as, there are many situations where I have to look at a situation and say, is this about me or is this about us? And I feel like the thing in me that that drives that question more now than ever is just kind of an awareness, my faith. So my faith is huge in my life, and I feel this calling or this connection to God and what would he want. And I see so much of Christ likeness in dangerous love, and how to see people as Christ would see them. And so we talk a lot about reconciliation and forgiveness in Groundwork, and I just kept thinking to myself, this is biblical. This is like how it was written, how we're supposed to live our lives. And so I think for me at the beginning too, I was wrestling with, how do I in a secular world really live into my faith and do a good job at that and love people. And yet, like, all around us, there's just madness and craziness and distractions and things that try and pull us away from that center. And so, yeah, I think the me, myself, and I, when that comes up, that's getting further away from God.
I love that you say that. Can I interject for a minute? Because that's really powerful. I work a lot with a lot of different religious groups, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist. And one of the things that I get a lot is, are you sure you're not a Buddhist? Like, this is like the essence of Buddhism. Are you sure you're not Jewish? Like at the deepest heart and center of our faith, I honestly had the chief imam of Jerusalem up at the Dome of the Rock, like, tried to convince me that I was Muslim, like, because of these things, and I'm personally identify as Christian, but I think that there is something to this idea of love, and like you say, that's biblical, that's actually ancient. about these ideas. And, a lot of times our individual expressions of those or organizational expressions of those in religions don't look like that, right? Especially sort of historically, right? The Crusades don't look like the greatest example of sort of Christ-like love, right? Throughout the world. But there is something that seems to be that people are getting at the heart of a lot of religious faith. And actually for my atheist friends out there, I think a lot of them reject religion because they don't see that there and are trying to get at this heart of the exact same thing without religion, which means that all of us in some ways are trying to get at the heart of something here that resonates deeply within us, but that whether we've lived it imperfectly or our cultures have lived it imperfectly or whatever is there. And so that, you saying like, oh, it's biblical. I mean, I hear that all the time. And of course I believe that in some ways because I also know my own lenses in writing and like what I grew up with and believing that Jesus is an amazing example of someone who exemplifies these principles of peace building. And, the New Testament is like just filled with these sort of encounters of Jesus doing this, sort of work, but also, seeing it in Buddhism and seeing it in Islam and seeing it in Judaism and lots of these other sort of spaces as well, that it's there. But if it calls to you, and I think this is sort of the thing, it doesn't really matter like what it calls to, but it's calling to something deep. If you're saying it's calling to like something that's at the core of like who you are and who you believe, and like listen to that call, right? It's calling you, for a reason. In the same way, like justification, like actually often calls us away from that, right? Like in sort of social psychological theory, cognitive dissonance is this idea that like when I make a mistake, I can have two quick choices, right? I can either just quickly admit that I have the mistake and get rid of the guilt that comes associated with that, or I can justify the mistake and come up with a very sophisticated reason of why I wasn't actually guilty of the thing. And over time, I can actually convince myself and the guilt can kind of go away. And then what people talk about all the time is then they'll get triggered. And the trigger is like the guilt starts to come back up. And while I don't think shame is particularly helpful, to me, guilt isn't a terrible thing because there's something inside us that's calling us. It says something's not right here. Like something isn't aligned with the true essence of who we are. In this moment, we're not fully living in to something that I think we all deeply know we want or yearn to be. And this is like a call. It's like a little smoke alarm that comes off. That's like kind of telling us like, come back to that, let go of the justifications and just sort of come back to that. So whenever that call comes, I'm like, don't justify it away at this moment. Don't like come up with a million reasons why it's there. Like run to the light, right? Like run to the light and watch that will heal you much quicker than coming back with another huge sense of justifications of why it wouldn't. And H, I just want to say to your point, I really appreciate that. And I did the same thing. I just want you to know, when I went to the Arbinger Institute workshop for the first day, it literally was a line in there. Now, what you should do when you go home is not run to your partner or someone else and tell them, hey, I've just been reading about self-deception and I actually think you need to read this book, or I actually, think you need to do this. Let it be internal. And I'm like, yep, let it be internal. 20 minutes later, man, I wish you were there. You would have, and immediately I made an enemy, like right away, like, what are you saying? I need to go to a workshop on self-deception, or, I wish I was there. And, even the other day we were in church and like one of our prominent church leaders was speaking and was calling on us to be peacemakers. And I was like so excited. I'm in the audience, like, this is the dream talk. Like, I wish we had these talks every day in church, right? And then he says my classic line, like, now you might be thinking that you wish so-and-so in the congregation was here, like so-and-so was listening or whatever. I'm nodding, I'm like, good, I'm glad he said that too. Let's go focus on it. And then I'm home with my wife. We've got a conflict that we're not with each other, but that we're having with somebody else. And what comes out of my mouth? Man, I just wish they had heard, that conversation. And so that part, what a natural desire, right? Like that, you have that conversation with your aunt, but we talk about this in Turn First, that like one of those moves is like I try to get in front of the other person, like we're back to back and we're elbowing, try to get in front of the other person. I think that's the peace move, but really it's more about getting them to see me than it is actually about me seeing them, and hoping that when they see me, right, they'll change, right? And that all of this that we're talking about is really about a more sophisticated way of persuading other people to see us as people. When really all it is when we turn first, we turn and look at their back, and let that be us seeing them without any sort of obligation that they need to see us. And when we can get to that space, and a lot of times I find in my life that it takes 3 or 4 or 5 attempts sometimes to get to that space where I'm actually turned, as opposed to not the other way. Then that's where the power is really going to come. And ironically, the minute I let go of any expectations that the other person changes, the minute I let go that they have to forgive me too, or they have to notice my pain or anything else like that, is often the moment when they actually notice. That's when they're free. And I freed them up to actually notice and see, is when I let go of any of those restrictions or obligations that, this will happen when we kind of do it simultaneously, or maybe you need to do it just a little bit before me.
Yeah, thank you, all of you, for sharing. We keep talking. Gotta wrap this up, and I've been trying to think as you're all sharing, kind of a way to, how do we theme this? And we don't have to, we've shared a lot of great insight and had some good questions today. But what's coming to mind, and a reminder for me, is we have moments. Some of us are fortunate enough to have moments where we can maybe see a little differently, where we can make those changes, where we make a realization, albeit hard sometimes. It's difficult to accept. We have those moments, and we ought to keep looking for those moments and stay consistent with it, and really hold those moments, lack of a better term, sacred, special to us, because there's glimpses that we have. Chad, you mentioned just a second ago of the light, and just keep running towards it. And what came to mind when you said that was, a quick story to wrap it up. But the only other person that was there was H. It was this year at the retreat. And, our retreat, there's a science to it. We break people down the first day, right? And then
Yes, you do.
and then, we have a couple of days of building everybody back up, but we always end the day, sharing biggest takeaways. And every other year, there's kind of this angst to get out of there. It's like, okay, we've spent 3 days here. We're exhausted. Let's go. That was not there this time. And people, usually every year, maybe a handful of people share, they kind of capture the whole vision. Most people are still wrestling internally, and maybe 5-6 people out of 30 capture this bigger vision of our community. We can come together. They capture the we, they capture the us. And it's always beautiful to hear that. To my amazement, this year, every single person captured it. And it was an amazing moment. I've never been in an environment like that where strangers, but 2-3 days ago, captured this we, and embraced this va, this space between. And every single person that shared, they weren't just talking about themselves, they were talking about what their community could become. And it was amazing. And I sat there in awe the whole time listening. And if you remember, H, I didn't quite know how to end. Everybody kind of looked up, and it's silent. Usually people are ready. Okay, let's go. But everybody's just waiting. Chris, how are you going to end this? And I didn't know. I didn't know how to end it. How do I put a cap on something that beautiful? And the only thing that came to mind was, culturally growing up, my dad from the islands and from the Philippines, we always remove our shoes when we go into homes and anywhere special and sacred. And I didn't know what else to do other than stand up in front of you guys and remove my shoes, which I did, because it was such a special moment that we all shared. And we have to seek after those moments, right? We have to look for those moments, try to create them. But then, like I've been hearing from Chad this whole time, stay consistent with it. Stay consistent with it, and keep trying, because a lot of times it's not going to feel so special or sacred, and it's going to feel yucky and nasty and hard and difficult. But to remember those times, and remember what we're capable of, and remember the potential that we have. And I enjoy these moments. I feel spoiled that I get to do these episodes and have wonderful people come on and remind me of those moments and create those moments. So thanks to each of you for joining the show. I appreciate all of you individually, and I hope you know that, and what you've contributed in my life and what you've contributed to Groundwork and our community. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure and quite frankly an honor to be on this panel with the three of you and meet the man, the myth, the legend. Although I will say I don't understand how you don't like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches.
Everybody has their fatal flaws.
Yeah. Thank you, Chad. Thank you, Chris. Great to meet you, H. And this is great.
Yeah, Chris, I like this format way better. And it's just cool to meet people and hear their stories and to interact. And so, yeah, thank you both for being vulnerable and talking about this. And, when I wrote the book, I really just hoped it would help some people in their life. Like, I can't mediate every dispute. I can't be there. So like, how can I write something to help some people? And so I just appreciate everything, and having these conversations helps me too. So, and Chris, thanks always for the platform. Appreciate it.
Of course.